Here we go.
Live stream is on.
Hello, Global Theater. My name is Gerry Fielka. It's August 8th, 2021. McLuhanMashup number 18. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Clinton Ignatov. Thank you, Clinton. And our special guest is Abbie Zee. What a pleasure, Abbie. Thank you so much. Okay, in McLuhanMashups, we talk in simple words, non-academic. For the normal person, that word could mean commoner or grassroots. So we'll start off with a little line from a McLuhan wrote a letter to New Society magazine about 51 years ago. And this is the first two lines of that letter. Why did you leave Karl Marx out of your inventory of hot gospelers? Are you trying to duck the pattern of finding categories for all? Do you think of him as an untalented scientist or also as an untalented quack like me? What two words to call Marshall an untalented quack of himself, and how dare they do it of Karl Marx? That is amazing. So let's start off with this simple question before we get in the knee deep in the swamp muck, gentlemen. We'll start with you, Clinton. Is life fair?
Oh, no. I mean, ideally for children, all society bends over backwards to make it fair for them when they're young for a little while until eventually reality bursts in and blows their life to smithereens. And then even that's not a constant. That only happens in some civilizations. The only time life is fair is when everyone else bends over backwards to create that illusion for someone.
Super. Okay, Abbie, is life fair?
I guess it depends on whose perspective.
Whose perspective? Yeah. Duncan said the other day, depends on what you mean by fair. And I goes, are you spelling that F-A-R-E or F-A-I-R?
Life is fair. Yeah, there.
Life's fair. So it is interesting. You know, we're using spoken word here, and words like T.S. Eliot said, when I talk to you, I got to use words, but I'm going to use a little stickum. Look, we're talking about Karl Marx. M-A-R-X or M-A-R-K-S, so Marx. So the next question, we'll start with you, Abbie. Why are you curious about Karl Marx?
I think he has good things to say that are helpful for struggles today.
Perfect. Okay, Clinton, why are you curious about McLuhan?
Couldn't say it better than Abbie just did. Likewise. You know, it's sometimes you encounter someone and their ideas end up reshaping your whole view of things in a way where everything else just felt like you had to listen to it, and then someone else talks and you get sucked into it. So you know, it's the thinking sort of takes on a mind of its own, right?
Yeah. So very good, gentlemen. This is a great start. Abbie, Abbie, tell me what is the most, in just simple terms again, the most misunderstood thing that others have expressed to you about Karl Marx in general. Just, you know, what you talk to people about Marx, what do they misunderstand in your opinion?
I guess, well, let me just take it from what you sent me this morning or yesterday, that Marx raised the idea of property. Was that the quote that you sent me from Verso?
There's one that says there were like 10 quickie quotes on the internet of Marx, and one of them said abolish private property.
Well, but you sent me as a teaser for today from a book of Verso that said,
oh, the Verso one. Yeah.
What was that?
Mackenzie Wark had a little thing on why Marx now, something like this, if I remember.
Yeah.
And I think it said something like Marx finally raised the question of property, the idea of property, put the idea of the seizure, not even the seizure, but just the idea of property. And I guess the basic confusion that people have is that Marx is just an idea man. And Marx was very clear that the role of studying political economy and history is not to understand it, but not to understand the world, but to change it.
Right.
Because there's such a saturation in our culture of academics and talking heads, people have relegated Marx to this kind of theoretical stand-in for whatever reflection they're seeing in the mirror. At least, especially the student types and the professorial types. So that's a big confusion.
That's a big confusion. Good. Okay. Clinton, same question. What's a most misunderstood of McLuhan that you've observed? You know, something. Yeah, go ahead.
I think this might resonate with Marx here. People will always say that ask what was McLuhan's theory of media, and or for instance, in the clip that we saw, there were words to the effect of, McLuhan said this is how we should think about media, and McLuhan wasn't about thinking, and he wasn't about theory. Those are abstract figures without ground or media content. McLuhan was about direct, raw perception of the real. He was about direct, embodied extension of yourself into your immediate surroundings and how tools are extensions of ourselves. So it wasn't about how much we think about our ideas, is how do we use them and relate. If we don't relate as them, then paradoxically we become them, or more specifically, they become us and they puppet us around, right? We have to understand how we are them when we use them and how our environment is inside of us. And that's not a theory. That's a lived, embodied relation to reality, which he called percepts. He said, I don't have any concepts, I have percepts. Yeah. So the first thing is that whenever people describe him, they say, he said we should think about things this way, or we should understand things this way, or his theory was this. It's like, no, there was no theories. He was trying to get away from abstractions towards the concrete and the material.
So could I just raise a question, Gerry? So we were talking about Marx and activism, and I should have known that. I mean, I know you want to talk about McLuhan, but it seems like you're asking me questions about Marx and Clinton questions about McLuhan. So is that our program for the evening?
No. We're going to, it's just in efforts to start off on your two backgrounds, because it's similar how you both have an interest like me in certain things. So I just thought we're going to talk about Marx mainly, but I just thought it's called McLuhanMashup. So we're going to bring in, because Marshall actually talked about Marx a lot. And so we're sort of like trying to clarify what we've learned about Marx through McLuhan with you who've learned about Marx from Marx, or other people.
Find some commonalities. I hope the conversation takes off on a life of its own here, right? Yeah.
That's what it will do. But I wanted to start off by saying, like, what's just the commonality again is, Abbie, what's an element of Marx that is understood, that in the general public for people who don't, because, Marx is like Einstein, Freud, Shakespeare, the Bible, Marx. And, I just got from you what they might have misunderstood. What's an understood thing about Marx in the general commonality,
Well, I think people think Marx has something to do with class struggle.
Right. So class struggle.
I mean, but if we reduce things to this level, we're not. I mean, it's like, see, I think that's more McLuhan's thing. It's like, let's float in the ether and make sure we don't really know. Put it out there, I don't have the warmest love for McLuhan theory. I find
No, that's all
frustrating.
right.
Cool.
Right.
The
That's
opposite.
all right.
Sure.
Yeah, that's all right. It's like this is where it's almost like a Mobius strip where we can like cross over and circle around. So it's not like we're not trying to debate or say one and the other. So I mean, basically that was a question that you brought up. You have ESP, Abbie, because Marx did say something like philosophers have interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. So, I mean, it's a basic thing. McLuhan was a literature guy. Was Marx a philosopher, a politician, or an activist? How do you believe that we can change things? And in what way or fashion have you learned to change things through your studies of Marx?
I think Marx was a revolutionary, first and foremost.
Right. And then how does that differ from being an activist and a philosopher? I mean, are they totally interwoven, or was Marx more a politician, a philosopher, and an activist in revolutionary ways? Or, what was his means?
I think he devoted his life towards struggle for the people as the truth provided. He didn't flinch from that, and he went in the direction that his findings took him. And philosophers, in the common term, are often at best divided between making peace with the world, maybe being criticizing it to some degree, especially academics in our time, but even in times past, generally served the elite of their times, though not to say in the process they didn't have many great contributions. And Marx, as much as anyone, learned from anyone and everyone. He cites his enemies and all sorts of people as to get at the truth. But he was unflinching in terms of through his experience in the struggles, coming from Prussia, participating in the revolutions of 1848, being an exile refugee for his whole life with his family. That was his profession as a revolutionary.
So you mean his study of philosophy helped set him up to be an activist, and then he strategized activist ways from studying philosophy?
Well, he was, I think, quite a gifted thinker, and he did get a PhD when he was young, but from very early on he was participating in the mass struggles of his time, and that was the key thing that he was figuring out what are the barriers to the movement, what are the key vulnerabilities and defeats, and how could he do anything in his power to help that in the future.
Well, then what were those strategies? Writing books, protesting? I mean, what were the main strategies he employed to be a revolutionary? Like, what was his action?
He was an organizer. He brought together the International Working Men's Association. He was part of revolutionary publications as a youth. He was a polemicist. He was very much about the movement, furthering it where possible. And he wrote Capital because he saw that was a real need, was to correct the confusions people had about what it would take to actually change our society. There was a theoretical gap, so he did that work to fill that theoretical gap. That was essential. Without his work, we would have been set back in terms of revolutionary struggles, maybe a long time, I think, to say, at a minimum. So he was not disconnected from the need. It was a need that provided the path forward for him, I think.
Right. So you read his work, then how does that directly influence what actions you take as being an activist? Because, you sent us a video of you working with people, working class people just dealing with housing in New York. And so, I mean, how is it grassrootsy helped you? You worked in the Occupy movement. You just talk about or just being an architect in China, right? Has Marx affected your work as an architect and like working in Occupy movement? I mean, where's the direct line that you got from him? Is there any that you can draw? You know,
I think how do we understand our world without the past movements? You know, how we got here. Even looking back to the foundations of what we call capitalism, or before that, you know, do we always have this system of capitalism? There was a system of feudalism, slavery before, and to see that things are actually contested right now. What are the big conflicts in the world? How do they play out in terms of, you know, who has the power in the society? All these things he really is very good at breaking down, and
so then how do you use that direct to do something in Occupy or help these low-income housing problems get resolved?
These basic things, you know, are we gonna solve things by getting a handout from people in charge or not? You know, I think he puts it forward that's not possible. That
right,
the power in the society. What does it take to really transform things? And so,
Clinton, go ahead if you have a question or a comment.
So I'm trying to. It's funny because Gerry's rules about keeping it down to lay levels of relatable explanation are always a fun challenge.
That's just,
yeah, no, that's cool, because when I think about what I know about Marx, I think about it from philosophy, how the material dialectic, and if I had to explain that straightforward, it would be, you know, philosopher Hegel had this dialectic, which then this later philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach sort of flipped around, and then Hegel got from Feuerbach this idea of how individual people in their real world sort of instantiate the changes that happen in the world, and it's only through real people doing things that changes happen. And for Hegel, it was like this idea marries that idea and they give birth to a new idea, right? Or this idea fights that idea, and the aftermath is this new idea. And it's all this philosophy in this headspace, right? But then for Feuerbach and then for Marx, it's like, no, people living their lives and doing things are the material of the world working itself out through individuals towards something greater. So first of all, I guess, am I close to the mark here?
Well, for what it's worth, I'm by no means an expert in these matters, and people ways to cut them. But I think the basic thing is, what creates reality? Is it idea? Is it the idea that creates reality, or is there a material reality that ideas are based on? And when I think people say Marx said Hegel on his head, there was contributions Hegel made about understanding how there's contradiction and conflict, and Hegel was basing that a lot on dealing with the world at that time, which was a lot of Christian ideology. He was definitely part of that, but there was a positive element where he was dealing with, well, there's interactions which have a complex nature, and you could study that, the different ways that works in terms of ideas leading to different things. But Marx said, there's a material reality that everything is based on, and
So when we're not dealing with the material reality, instead we're dealing with all these abstract values that are measured in things like money and all these categories and whatnot, we get alienated from the work we're doing, and we get alienated from who we are or where we are, right? That was the problem to be solved largely in the philosophical sense.
Well, that's what some people phrase it as. The main thing is alienation, but I think my understanding is that he was working on something a little bit more nuanced than that. Because if you're talking alienation, it's everyone's trying to find, how do I not get alienated? And then everyone reads a self-help book, and maybe reads a little bit of Marx and goes to a poetry session. And,
take a walk in nature once a week.
But let's go right on that. That's a great point. Is alienation more innate or more invented in humans? What would you say, Abbie?
Well, I don't really understand exactly what you mean by alienation there. I think in some of history of Marxism and revolutionary struggle, you talk about how in capitalism the worker is alienated from the produce of his or her labor, and that there's surplus value which is extracted, and that's exploitation. So there's that basic reality that's part of our system, and there's implications to that. But alienation, an abstract thing, I think it gets into, it's too broad for me to understand really what we mean by that. Is it part of human nature? Is it created?
Right, but is is class struggle, is class part of nature? Like, are humans innate to have classes, or is it something humans invented?
I think we can see that classes haven't always existed in human society. For most of human history, there was no state. People lived in pretty much equal societies for thousands and thousands of years. It was only at the earliest maybe 7,000 or so years ago, that you have the rise of the accumulation of property that leads to class differentiation, and eventually to forms of slavery, which in earlier societies did not exist. We have the archaeological evidence and lots of evidence to show that, but it's a similar path which most human societies went through. So it's
it did come out. So what caused that?
I think as you have the development of people's productivity in the land, that you start to have greater interactions with other tribes early on too, and there's a greater accumulation. Early on, there wasn't the basis for one group of people to accumulate and others to just work.
Right.
There was a condition of near starvation, and so there was a need for people to share and work together. So once you first have this surplus, that creates the basis for this inequality, and also you have then beginning of different relations with outsiders too. There's all these histories that say initially that there was no slavery. People would either, if there was a captive in a war, they would either be made part of a tribe or killed. There wasn't the basis for actually have someone in an unequal relationship, because that would challenge the whole nature of that community. But once you start having that accumulation, then you start to have differentiation internally, externally. So things kind of come in motion that way. That's how I understand it.
Well, that was good. And Clinton, jump in anytime, but I'm just asking, is surplus is the word that came up in our group this week discussing this? Is like surplus was a key factor in causing this. Some people I've talked to in the past, I say, what's the invention that changed humans the most impactful invention ever in the history of humanity? And they said agriculture, and that's what caused surplus, sort of. So, I mean, I'm not saying I know it's right or wrong. I'm just saying this is one thing that's come up. So it's back to philosophers have interpreted the world in many ways. So people have sussed this out and go, okay, well, maybe the invention that changed us, caused surplus, was agriculture, or whatever. What caused surplus to happen on Earth? What caused agriculture? But Marx would say, but the point is to change it. So if we go, well, our inventions change us. No, it's how we use our inventions. So how could, if humans change their use of agriculture and surplus at the beginning so they wouldn't, mess things up? I'm just curious. How did Marx talk about that? Like, well, you guys just set up this form, this environment of agriculture, which caused surplus, and you could have,
I know this is a huge rabbit hole you're going into, Gerry, because
right.
It's like you can't assume all the different tribes all over the place and all the different people in their own scenarios aren't gonna all do the right thing. Like, well, what was the right thing to do thousands of years ago? I mean, it's kind of a funny head game, because
I think it's a key question. Sorry, please go on.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, it is a rabbit hole. That's where we're going. So no, it's ridiculous, because we can't,
Sure.
It's like what Wyndham Lewis said. Artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the past. No, the
For the
future.
past.
No, the artists live in the present and write a detailed history of the future. So I'm saying we can't go back and change the past. We don't even know if the history was written correctly. We
Well,
know
the history wasn't written. It's been put together from the artifacts we're digging out of the ground and the garbage heaps we find in the
Right.
architectural excavation, or no, the archaeological excavations. So for the
But-
last 70 years or so, the language that people argue about this over has been the language of cybernetics. So
Right.
if you're gonna think about things in feedback loops, right? It's basically it's like entropy from thermodynamics, the language of energy, moved into this one model fits all idea of everything as information, and hey, let's measure this and let's measure that, and we can generate a surplus if we do it this way, and we'll build a positive feedback loop and accumulate more and more and more. And that goes for power, goes for human capital, it goes for everything. And so we're kind of all bogged down inside of this way of looking, which was only come up with so that we can feed it all into a computer, because that's how computers work, to measure numbers this way. So for the last 70 years, we've been bogged down in ways of thinking which come to us based on the technology we have, the newest technology we have, which is computers, right? So I mean, we're in like machine capital now, and it's a system of its own because the computers do their own thing. I think like that's where we're at now.
But that's good, because I'm talking about the present as us three here in a Zoom talking this. So Abbie, you were going to tackle that question I brought up, but indeed it's a funny thing because we talk about three ways of communication basically with words. There's gesture and there's a million gray area other mains, but spoken word, printed word, and electronic word. Basically, Marx was spoken word and a printed word guy. Now, electronic word came in with the telegraph, but he wasn't subsumed in, I don't know about radio, TV, definitely not computer. But now we learn of Marx through the electronic word. So you remember the question I asked, Abbie? You were going to say something about it, like, did Marx reflect on the fact that maybe we could have done the agriculture surplus thing better or a different way?
Well, it's actually Engels was Marx's close collaborator and comrade and friend that wrote a lot about this question. And what Engels describes is he researches the history, not just history, but including through mythology, literature, everything that he has, and found a lot of patterns from different civilizations around the world where pretty much the pattern more or less comes together, where there was the rise of inequality and class oppression. But there isn't really an example of people going in a different direction. Now, there's a lot of resistance to that, and the path it took is determined on many different historical articulations. The pattern plays out, but if you look at, say, even Greek mythology, there's evidence of a time when there wasn't this kind of patriarchal dominated society where there was relative equality, and you see that played out in the myths about the gods, actually, and Athena and Zeus are kind of parables for what happened. And if you actually look at the record, the changes in Greek society following the rise of property, and you see that also among the Iroquois, that Engels was studying very closely based on the work of Morgan, who was a New York intellectual who lived among the Iroquois and studied their society, and compare that to other peoples, including evidence of people in Hawaii at the time. But in short, yeah, you see this. There wasn't an exception. Is this a good alternative that was brought up to me? Is imagine there's aliens on a different planet, and let's say if they became intelligent, would they develop class society just like we did and have to struggle through that and eventually abolish it? Maybe, hard to say, you know. But the one thing that is good to keep in mind is right now we have a society where there's more than enough for everyone to have enough to eat and have shelter. This is one of the first times in human history that this is possible. So that does create the possibility for a real different world where you don't need this brutal inequality anymore. and that wasn't always there. So that's something that's changed. So.
Yeah, it applies directly to the community I live in, because Venice, California, for COVID, the last year and a half was swarmed by homeless people. And everybody freaked out eventually and said, you got to do something. We can't take it. Now, I've known all these homeless people in Venice for years, 15 years. They've been living on the boardwalk. But every Friday, they had to pick up their backpack of stuff, move it 2 blocks, and then they spray down the boardwalk, and then they come back and live there. So if you don't clean that up every week, they're just going to accumulate all the crap the yuppies throw out. So they build these big shanty towns, and they were like, this is horrible. And then the rich yuppies come and start torturing them, saying the homeless druggies are starting fires. So just to cut to the chase, sorry to ramble, but one of my friends is one of the best artists in Venice. He lives on the boardwalk for 15 years and can sell his paintings to German tourists for $1,000. He doesn't need an art gallery. And they go, we got to get all these people homeless. We got to get them housing. Now there's so much money in Venice and LA. They got all these people housing, supposedly, because there's no one there anymore. It looks like a ghost town. And Vinny got the hotel right in front of where he's lived for 15 years. A ocean view, the window. So I asked my other friend, how's Vinny doing? He goes, well, every day he looks like a wet puppy, down in his spot, because he doesn't have his normal home with his paintings and his guitar out there. He's got it up in an apartment. Now he's happy. And, the irony is they have to operate on a curfew. So they got to be in by 10 p.m. So one of my friends gets in at 10:01, and the guy goes, you can't come in. It's 1 minute after. He says, oh, gee, I'll have to go sleep on the street just like I have for the last 20 years. What's the difference? But it is this thing about housing means you're okay. Well, now that's making him more druggy. They're trapped in a 4 room, so it has services and disservices. So I'm just saying, once humans invented surplus in agriculture, it had services and disservices. So isn't the long run how we cope with the disservices? Do we want to change it? We created unions, and again, labor unions have services and disservices. So, I mean, how did Marx deal with this, knowing he could try to change things, but can he really change things? Did he believe he could really change things, and did he?
Well, he believed that people would change things, that there's an objective conflict ongoing between the people who are in charge, who have the capital in society, as he puts it, and those who don't. And that is kind of a motor of history. So that the question isn't, can he change it, but he was helping clarify some of the contours of that struggle so others would take it up, and they sure did.
They did change it. And how do you feel? How would you articulate they did change it?
If you look at the revolutionary movements that really took off soon after his writings, actually, and what he writes about in some of the prefaces to Capital is, at first, there wasn't much of an audience right away, but the working class were ate it up, actually, very quickly, especially in England at the time. It was the intellectuals who had trouble understanding Capital, but because the movement was very strong, then the working class was really adept at reading it and applying it to the struggle, and the need to not just settle for a little increase of wages, but to see that there's a world to win, actually, and which really shook Europe and eventually led to revolutions in Russia and so on. So very powerful.
Is this what developed like in Norway and Sweden, where we actually have socialism that thrives?
I don't think Marx would call those countries socialism.
Why is that? How?
I Marx talks about socialism as a dictatorship of the proletariat, where the people have power and control of the society and dictatorship over the exploited peoples that remain. And it's a transitionary period to the abolition of class relations altogether. So there's a period where there is a struggle to go in one direction or the other. In Sweden and these countries, you have kind of more of a distribution of profits to people, but you don't have the actual people owning in control of the industries and enterprises. It's just a different distribution.
Yeah, the term in Canada we use to self-identify with is mixed economy. So we'll describe our healthcare system as socialist, at least more so, say, compared to the States, right? So it's a mixed economy. There's some things that are privatized, and then some things are administered by the state, and then, or the crown, if you like, would be our preferred parlance, because again, we're now is that the proletariat? Probably not, right? It's an iconic figurehead that's inherited from systems that far predated any of the theory that we're talking about, right? And that's still where most countries are at, is living within the structures of centuries of established, right? America is probably the newest country in the world to have made up their own thing from scratch and had been able to get it going, having after their revolution with the three, the House of Congress and the executive branch and the judicial branch, right? They got their own thing going. McLuhan would say, based on the back of the printing press, the fact that they could build everything out of sending letters to one another, right? But so it's interesting because transitioning out of nation states seems like a very difficult thing to do towards empowering ultimately everyone equally at the end of the game, right? People are somewhat empowered by democracy as it stands, insofar as being able to vote for who rules over them every couple of years, if we assume in the ideal sense that everything's all fair there, which of course it's not, right? But then, so people are pretty comfortable with that compromise. People in Canada are pretty comfortable with having a mixed economy, and and as you said, Sweden and Norway, I think that most people who live there probably enjoy the benefits of their system and whatnot. So are these challenges to be overcome, or are these wins to be to pat ourselves on the back over of having won so far, these affordances or services of
Well, yeah, there's a certain approach that says everything is equally terrible, and I think that's really it's good to compare different systems, even if they're not, as Marx or myself would call them, socialist. I think definitely America would probably be a better place if it was more in ways and had some of Canada's approaches, and Canada other places, and probably vice versa. America applies some things that Canada doesn't have. But it's important to keep the eye on the prize, because in communism, the idea is that there's no class oppression, there's no class relations, there's not even this idea of reform in terms of making things more equal, because there's this idea that equality has a premise of inequality. So we say, well, we're not making things more equal, but that's based on the idea that things have to be unequal. So the idea is we're fighting for a society without even the basis to exploit people altogether. That's a very radical difference from what we understand in our education as the most fair, state. Where, okay, the homeless won't be as hard off. We'll give them a few pennies to, not starve to death. But forget about power. Forget about determining their future. That's what are you, crazy? That's not on the table.
Well, right. Well, you can have power and you can determine your future as long as you don't get a leg up over everyone else. Well, so I don't know. There's an inherent logical contradiction, and we're dumbing things down to the point where everything is going to contradict itself. So,
If there's no, why would someone want to? If people are actually working together, and there's no inequality, there's no need for people to exploit each other, that there's actually a system that people do better off when they cooperate. What does it mean to get a leg over someone else? Where would that come from?
Oh, like Lord of the Flies, the novel. I mean, people do it.
And that's a novel, right? Based on what? Based on our reality.
Right. Right. Well, there's an assumption in the novel. It's funny. Gerry's question is about, is such and such innate, or is it invented? She's trying to get to this nature versus nurture argument, which again is another rabbit hole. Which we could waste a lot of time even defining terms before we got anywhere.
I don't know. It seems. I mean, do you think everything is just? There is this idea of original sin, that people are just selfish, and I've seen people change a lot, based on what's going on around them.
Mm-hmm. Well, that education and awareness and empowerment seems to me to be like the thin edge of the wedge to positive change, and that would probably begin with teaching people that they don't need to spend most of what they're. You don't need to spend money on stuff that you could do for yourself if you knew how. Like if think of all the people who literally don't know how to cook and can't even walk into a grocery store to put together a healthy, nourishing, tasty meal that they would continue to build a habit to make for themselves and their friends, time and time again, and not, blow their income paying, the surplus value to feed them, overworked employees to make their food for them every night out of the takeout restaurant even. Right, like the education of things that people don't know how to do for themselves because it's not a part of the educational system. It's not a part of their culture anymore to learn in the house, because both their parents are working. They're not learning how to cook their own food anymore. Right. I mean, that's kind of speaking from experience here. So this is like, you change that, you could change the entire world overnight. It's a matter of education and empowerment.
Why is that? Is it just because there's not enough teachers? I don't think so. I think it's because the system operates on greed and profit and exploitation, and people are being beaten over the head viciously with these values because it serves the people who are in charge. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the overwhelming majority of what people consume in terms of media and social media and broadcast media. Mm-hmm. And they say, "Oh, you fool! You could just do it right." But everyone their whole lives, is dealing with this nonsense, dealing with cruelty.
Now you're coming into my wheelhouse because it's awareness of how the media is shaping all these parts of you, which could be overcome towards positive gains in that sphere, yes, right?
But the difference is the issue just we don't get it that's media, or is the issue where's this friggin' media coming from? It's coming from a ruling elite whose interests are not aligned with ours. Unless we deal with that question, which is the key question that Marx is putting forward. There is a dictatorship in our society, a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. We think we have democracy. We don't. We have dictatorship of the ruling class, of the bourgeoisie over us, and they have democracy for the bourgeoisie. Democracy for the bourgeoisie, dictatorship over the people. And that's something we're constantly told. Oh, don't believe. Just like that movie They Live shows. I mean, I'm sure you've seen that movie, right, Gerry?
But here's a good thing, because you both brought up things. You brought up a movie, and Clint brought up a book. So these two are medias and invented medias, a printed word and electronic word. And this is really important because is it a reflection of where people are at, what they're thinking, or is it created by people who want to control other people? So that's to address Clinton's idea was Lord of the Rings was a book that we read in school. They taught us this book. Now, just about a half a year ago, it came out that these kids lived Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Flies, we're talking.
Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Sorry for misspeaking. They lived Lord of the Flies, and they did not act like the kids in the book. Now, that's not our job is as artists or creators or writers is to imagine anything. So if we imagine something, does that cause us to do it that way or alleviate us of doing it that way? And so when you bring up a movie, it's the same thing. Does the movie, say a violent movie, which I try to avoid all violent movies, but just personally, They're not bad. They're just something I don't want to consume. Do they alleviate people of being violent, or do they cause people to be violent? So we don't know. The mystery of art, as Auden the poet says, is we don't know if it activates or pacifies us. But I think that's sort of what all human inventions do. We don't know if they accomplish what they were created for, or they accomplish the opposite.
I'd I'd venture to guess that the view that say religion is the opiate of the masses would imply that media pacifies more often than not. It would be a safer assumption. The fact that you're sitting on your butt watching a movie kind of lets you imagine it. You get the catharsis without having to do anything.
But that's a great question, or to bring up, because where did Marx get his oomph? What motivated Marx to want to change the world? By just sitting there? No, he's probably talking to people, reading people, something in his DNA, some muse hit him. What caused him to do that and say, well, we can change things? So, I think it's, again, a really broad question, but it is the root of what we're talking about. Like, is America more a plutocracy or a democracy? Is it run by the rich because they're greedy, or is that a byproduct of creating economics in surplus?
You ask all these questions, like these are all, there's no thing that's valuable. In terms of media, not all media is putting people to sleep. I think some can help wake people up. But the point I put forward, not to say it's right, but it's just to say it's an argument that's different, I think, from what McLuhan's theory leads people to see, is that the media is overwhelmingly controlled by the interests of the elite, I think, in our country, because they have the power, just like they have the power over the politicians, overwhelmingly. And does that mean all media is, maybe it's good, maybe it's bad? Well, look at it on a case-by-case basis.
There were the history of the internet. You've got two failures to sort of capture it and corporatize it. So in the early 90s, there was like AOL and AOL keywords and CompuServe and all these little corporate controlled golden cage walled gardens of pay by the minute to use our little private online cyberspace. And then the World Wide Web came out and blew that out of the water. And then take two, there's the .com bust. Okay, we're going to create all the biggest websites, so pets.com, this.com, and we're going to try to capture everyone, and the corporations will take over the internet away from all the random people just doing their own thing and not making any money. And then the .com bubble burst in the year 2000 because it was just a whole bunch of venture capitalists funneling money into nowhere with no way to keep everyone contained. And so for when I was growing up for 10 years, from the year 2000 to about 2008, 2009, the mantra was, you can't make money on the internet. It's impossible. The internet's a wild west, right? You can't make money on there's no business models there. Right? And then finally, it took Steve Jobs stealing everyone's smartphone and putting a computer in there, but telling them it's a phone, and then having only a few apps on them, and then not teaching them anything else, and then keeping them stuck on the little Facebook world and keeping them, right? Not telling them this is a computer, not teaching them anything about computers. Like, oh, you just use your phone to do this, use your app to do that, trust us to take care of everything. They finally were able to sort of take over a collective part of the internet and keep it under control for a sizable enough number of the population, where now we're dealing with, once again, the problem you're describing, the control of the media by the few, or the bourgeoisie. So again, I think the history of that, social media could be one more bubble that's about to burst, and then heavens knows where we'd be with everyone with a computer connected to heavens knows who and God knows what. With that's the whole worry about fake news and deep fakes and the dark web and all these terms that are made up to explain to the lay people what they don't understand about the computer they have in their pocket and how it could free them from everything that you're talking about if they knew how to use it properly, which gets back to my whole idea of education. This is where my thoughts have been going here on
It's
that.
getting
So when you say,
scarier.
yeah, when you say it's like the media are always controlled from on top, it's like, well, the last 30 years have been the story of that, of being attempted and failing and being tempted and failing and now being attempted again, and we're living through another bubble, or we're living through the recapture and we're going to have NBC and ABC and the four network broadcasters once again, like it was in the 60s, right?
Well, if only if it was just a repeat. I feel like it's more like a downward spiral, getting worse and worse. As long as these people are in control, their relative wealth compared to the people gets more and more. There's fewer and fewer actually of them who have more and more. I think it's 8 people in the world control 50% of the wealth or something like that right now. And they fear the people because they know there's an issue here. And even like this little, nice conversation of ours, I almost feel bad at putting it on the internet because the way these things work now, if you read Snowden's book, every single thing there, it sits in a database, is analyzes, is the threat, who is this person, what are they saying, what are they part of? And it's not in our interest. It's just getting more and more dark, actually, and there's less and less actual breathing room, in a sense.
Tell me about it. Yeah.
Because we're like, this is great, gentlemen, because we're like filling content. And when McLuhan said the medium is a message, he wasn't saying one of them was more important than the other. He was saying we don't usually pay attention to the form. We pay more attention to the content. And so he's saying, no, they're both important, but I'm going to emphasize one to make make a bigger point, or like we were told it was like Beavis and Butthead. He was just doing it as an aside, like the medium is a message. Ha ha ha. So this is like, if you study McLuhan's first book, Mechanical Bride, the first paragraph or so, he says, he brings up literature, Edgar Allan Poe, and he brings up Descent in the Maelstrom short story. And he said, the sailor studied the pattern recognition of the boat smushed by the waves, and he was taking it down to his death. And he studied the patterns of the boat pieces, and he swooshed his way out of dying. So he said, we're living in a sensory overload of media, call it social media or whatever you want to call it right now, sensory overload, social media overload, and we can use those ways to flip our way out of it, that we can use a breakdown and have a breakthrough, that they don't own these ways. I'll give you a real practical example. In the movie Berkeley in the 60s, the Black Panthers are interviewed and they go, we heard that Mao's Little Red Book was good. So we went to Chinatown and bought a bunch of copies for a nickel and sold them to all the hippies for $5. We eventually read the book and it's pretty good. So, that was an example of them being capitalists, making money for the Black Panther movement, but they're selling Mao's Little Red Book. And so this is like, what is the means to get us out of this? We're not, a downward spiral is like, is human progress cyclical or cumulative? Well, it could be a cone, like you brought up so astutely. Abbie, is like a spiral, and sometimes it spirals up and sometimes it spirals down. So it seems we're going in circles, but how can we literally utilize the internet, newspapers? My friend has put out, newspapers, political newspapers in LA for 20 years, and he still does it. Now, how many people read them? Well, it takes 100 flyers for one person to read it and be effective. So, we think newspapers are going away. I get newspapers every day out of the garbage. All the, Wall Street Urinal, Michael Moore calls it the enemy's tip sheet. It's like we can utilize these means and create new ones. That's what George Lakoff says. In order to change anything, he's a neuroscientist. He said you have to use the means that we have and invent new ones. So I think, Clinton, your suggestion is people should know what this thing we're using, a laptop, and what a cell phone is made of, how it works, so that we can use it to our advantage.
Sure. We might not be streaming to YouTube. We could be streaming to some other platform. Or
Yeah.
This is not Zoom. We're using free open source software. Which is being paid for by a commercial element of a company which is producing this free software that anyone can run on their home computer. Right? There's a million avenues, but getting
you're right.
Caught up to the 21st century is a Herculean task of flushing the Augean stables of a whole bunch of misinformation about what the world is made of.
But that was beautiful, Clint, because we want to be metaphorical. And Abbie, you're right. Well, what use is this? And I heard once someone say, 2 people talking is the revolution. That's one of the words that you brought up early. Abbie, and I thought that was important because McLuhan talked about that. Evolution is adapting to exploration, and we're just explorers here. We're just talking, and re-evolution is re-evolving. That's what revolution is. That we figure there's a problem, and what can we do about it? It's not like we know there's a problem. What can we do about it? So let's stay metaphorical for a second and just tackle this. This is a Marx line. Necessity is blind until it becomes conscious. Freedom is the consciousness of necessity. Can we imagine freedom? That's the next question. So off of Marx's quote, the question is, can we imagine freedom? What do you think, Abbie? In any comment on Marx talking about freedom is the consciousness of necessity?
Or I think that quote, Marx said it, I believe Hegel said it first.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
I think it's a very good quote.
But what does the quote basically mean to you personally? What is it saying? Necessity. Yeah, go ahead.
But if you see if you don't understand what's necessary, there is no freedom. There's just captivity to confusion. So it doesn't mean that there's only one necessity, but if there's a recognition that something is necessary, then there's freedom to pursue that. There's clarity.
Well, that's what Sartre said. Can we imagine we are free? So how would you answer that? Can we imagine freedom?
Well, that's kind of I think we could imagine a different world. I think that's possible. Now, does that mean that you understand that we can really just in our own minds liberate ourselves from where we are? I think all of us come out of a very depraved and corrupt society, and our ideas are stamped with that. And we can struggle to unite with what's positive and deal with that and transform, but we can't completely separate ourselves from where we come from or where we are in any time. So imagination is based on reality itself. What is your brain but a mirror for the universe, right? That's processing that. So in a way, your imagination is just a reflection of the present and the actual differences or the contradictions that exist in it. So
that's good, because see, imagine comes from a word image, which is a visual sense. So Clint, I'm going to read the line again and ask you the question. That was really good, Abbie. I appreciated that. Necessity is blind until it becomes conscious. Freedom is the consciousness of necessity. Can we imagine freedom?
Doing the necessary means knowing what's necessary. Yeah, I like the point Abbie made about imagination being right. If we are mirrors of our outer reality, what tends to happen more often than not is we're mirrors of the surface of outer reality, and the surface of outer reality always lies, right? An easier way to get into this stuff, which people know about more, would be Jean Baudrillard and simulation and simulacra, or just the idea that the appearance of things, especially mass-produced things with industrialism, means every can of soup on the shelf looks the same for 6 years until there's a redesign, and then it says same old taste, same great taste, new can, right? All right, and it's like if there's one copy of this one can with this one perfect, platonic ideal soup that just constantly exists, and we can forget about the factory and we can forget about its origins, and right. So we live in a simulated reality where artificial, great pop flavored slushies are like 6 levels removed from what a grape tastes like. Because now it's a slushy that tastes like your favorite grape pop, which is an artificial chemical rendition of what people think a real grape were to taste like if you were to concentrate it 100 times to what it actually tastes like, right? So that's sort of where, right? So we live in a simulation of reality naively to our senses, and then when we take that in, the world that we end up thinking that we live in, we're totally alienated from, right? It does come back to alienation for me, and that's what the element of Marx's writing which resonates with me most is the idea of the alienation of people from themselves, from other people, and from the world around them. And so consciousness would be the amelioration, would be the fixing, the right consciousness, and the freedom to act, to do what's necessary would start with me for dispelling those sort of illusions by making people into the mirrors of reality that they ought to be. But by default, that entire game is rigged with a million traps and tricks to waylay you straight away. That's the entire game of commercial interests and advertisements, which we could call capitalism.
I have one more thought about this, if that's okay, Gerry.
Yeah, please.
Sure, of course.
It's a very simple way of thinking about it. Let's say you need to go outside and it's raining outside. You think, oh, my feet are going to get all wet. What am I going to do? And someone might be confused and they're like, oh, but I have some shoes. I can put them on. That's freedom to, okay, I know what to do. I'm going to get those shoes and get outside. Otherwise, I'd be stuck.
Yeah.
In a bigger way, what's going on with humanity? Humanity actually isn't a bad predicament. It's extreme and actually increasing, per Marx's argument, increasing exploitation in the world. As machines and get more and more productive, what's exploited, what's extracted from people's labor is increasing actually. Despite if we say, oh, now we have a cell phone now, but in terms of relative exploitation is increasing. The power differential between the elite and those who are, masses is increasing actually. So it's actually freedom is ultimately the knowledge and the necessity to overthrow this whole thing, because that's really what's hitting us in the head every day. And there's lots of dead ends in that process, but there's a way out. I think that's a key thing that comes up in some of the better political writings I've read in the past, including in Chinese, that there needs to be a way out for people, and that's what people are looking for. And often
well, always give your enemy an escape plan. I think is I'm not sure if Sun Tzu actually said it, but let's ascribe it to him for fun. Right. So there has to be an escape plan for people, or there needs to be a way out for people, implies that we can make a whole bunch of media that sells people on a revolution that they think is going to liberate them. Right. I mean, obvious flaw number one in the plan. I just throw that out there.
I think you're talking in a sense of like an escape valve. But when I say way out, kind of a way out of the mess that we're in. There's a quick story I'll share from this wonderful writer, maybe you've heard about, called Lu Xun. It's in English, Luxn. He has a parable of, let's say you see people who are sleeping in a burning house. His friend asked, and his friend asked him, if you woke them up and they couldn't get out, would you still wake them? And Shun's answer eventually was, yes, you have to wake them up, because at least there's hope. Maybe they'll find some way out. Is an interesting way that he put it.
Oh.
So, I like that story. But
Yeah,
that's the
I
way
think.
out.
Yeah, I think it's well, the big question is, are you an optimist or a pessimist? Are you a Pollyanna? Are you a realist or what? So let's go through a couple more Marx lines that you can help us clarify. One is, all that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and human is at last compelled to face with sober senses their real contradictions of life and their relations with their kind. That to me is Marx being a little poetic, but how do you suss that out? How's that make you feel, Abbie? Do you know that line? You want me to read it again?
I've heard it and I've read it, and honestly, I think your interpretation of that line would probably be more valuable than mine. I think a lot of things with Marx is it's important to read him in not just single quotes, if possible, but these
Right.
quotes are part of pretty well put together arguments and part of things. So, it's kind of a cop out, because it'd be great if I'm not, a die-in-the-wool scholar of everything Marx has written. It'd be good. I mean, it's worth it, but so I would say that let's read what that's part of and read it in its entirety. But it definitely, But
taking it out of context isn't fair. And it's true, because that's really what McLuhan has taught us, is that the context and the environment is so important. But within, it's called media simplex. It's simple and it's complex. But Clinton, did you want to react to that, Marx, or you want me to move on to another one? Did you want to say anything about that one?
Okay, well, read it to me again.
All that is solid melts in the air. All that is holy is profaned, and the human is not at last compelled to face with sober senses their real conditions of life and their relations with their kind.
It's funny because when I first, all that solid melts in the air, that makes me think of hardware turning to software, let's say.
Yeah.
Or of commodities becoming digital, right? Or basically of physical commodities and the scarcity of material objects, which used to be what markets were all about, material objects. And if you can make thousands of copies of one book, but you still gotta get the paper and the ink and there's a few of them, and when they all wear out, if there wasn't some scribe to go make a new one, then they were all gone, right?
Well, I looked it up, and it comes from the Manifesto, which is a pretty good document to read. And he's kind of saying what you're saying, and I'm just starting a few paragraphs above, but it says the bourgeoisie has stripped of its halo every occupation hitherto honored and looked up to with reverent awe. It has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, the poet, the man of science into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil, has reduced the family relationship to a mere money relation. The bourgeoisie has disclosed how it came to pass that the brutal display of vigor in the Middle Ages, which reactionaries so much admire, found its fitting complement in the most slothful indolence. It has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. It goes on, the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and therefore the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. And that's the paragraph. I'm not going to keep on going because we have limited time, but that's the paragraph. This is all that is solid melts into air. To me, it's just an example that it's when people say, oh, you got to read some Marx to understand things. I think people have the idea, well, I don't have a million years, but it all takes like 2 minutes and you're like, okay, I get what he's saying. But society turns it just like a buzzword. You're like, okay.
Yeah. So
that was beautiful. Hold on one second, Clint. The beauty is that we flip the internet's immediacy into you picking that up and reading it in context. Go ahead, Clinton.
True. Yeah. what's important to me about that whole phrase is that Marx is taking things that other people talk about as abstract systems, and he's putting them into people and pointing the finger at people who are doing it. He's not saying, industrialism created all of these means of production, and the printing press, or the stamp, which pumps out, which has erased handicrafts, right? Until the Industrial Revolution, an artisan or someone would make tools by hand, and everything was a handicraft. And then once things start getting mass produced on demand, and you can just pump out so-called Oriental rugs on a loom overnight and sell them whenever you want, and you devalue the labor of the artisan who had made a thing, right? He's describing the same process that, say, Siegfried Gideon talks about in Mechanization Takes Command. But Siegfried Gideon says, look, mechanization did this. Mechanization took command. And so in that segment Abbie just read, Marx is saying, no, the bourgeoisie took command using mechanization. The bourgeoisie did this, the bourgeoisie did that. He's always trying to bring it back to the human scale, to the human level, where any one person would say, well, no, I had to do that, right? They're being technologically determined, as though they didn't have a free will. They just had to do the expedient thing. And, no, like, I don't really have a choice. That's just the way things are. And I got to do this thing. And if I didn't do it, someone else would have done it. So what difference does it make? Blah, 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 right? It's disempowering. So in a way, by fingering the bourgeoisie, there's this philosophical point where Marx is saying, that didn't just happen. These things didn't just happen, right? The system didn't just go crazy, because there's no such thing as a system. There's people. These people are doing this. And then from there results this thing you're all calling the system, as though it's this abstract ghost that we have to appease or make sacrifices to, or re-engineer like a giant machine.
Well, I would say yes and no, because yes, they're people, but I think if we look closer at it, the argument breaks down. There's people, then there's people, and his argument is that classes are defined really by their relationship to the means of production, by their relationships to production itself. The bourgeoisie is itself the reflection of what its existence, its parasitic existence that feeds off the people. And so in a way, they are the agents of capital, is the argument here. So, and in some ways that demystifies them from being these evil overlords, and okay, these people are really reflections of their material reality. That's their existence. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's a lot of obsession with, the enemy, and wow, they're so powerful, they're so evil. But there's kind of, I think, a distancing from that sort of visceral. Of course, there is hatred of some of these people from what they do to humanity, but then there's this understanding of it. Well, how could it be but any different? How could these people do anything but create a world in this image of constant profit and exploitation and war and division? It could not be but this in our current state of affairs. Unless this is
yeah, no, this has been really good, because we'll sort of wrap it up now, but I have another little thing I want to read and get you fine gentlemen who are teaching me a lot. I thank you. Audre Lorde said, the poet, you brought up poets, she said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. And Yvonne Rader, one of her peer groups, said, you can if you expose the tools. So it is like an onion. There's many layers to this. And what I've appreciated with both of you is that you've both uncovered many layers, because I think the solid melts into air quote, which you put into context so well, Abbie, was similar to what McLuhan was saying, is that we can reveal the hidden psychic effects, the surface appearance. There's on different modes of production that there's like, again, Mark Twain said it really well. He said, when I have a hammer in my hand, everything looks like a nail. So it's like, how much is this spoken word that we're sharing right now? How much is the printed word, which we've learned from? affected us in learning what we're talking about. So, Frank Zappa used music and printed word and spoken word, and he helped teach me that we need to embrace contradictions, and that the only way to change the system is to work from within the system. Not only, but one of the ways. You can't just say, like one of my friends said, I want to get rid of capitalism. And I go, well, great. What's your plan to replace it with? Because this is prevalent in if you're going to just destroy it, what are you going to replace it with? Which may be the difference between rebellion and revolution. Rebellion might be saying there's something wrong. Revolution might be saying there's something wrong and I got to change. I want to change it. And here's another plan. So this is it's a couple of lines. Bear with me. This is Marshall McLuhan talking about Marx in 1952. A common observation of European visitors to America is that life here is more collectivized and more stereotyped than communists have ever aimed to achieve. It is also the central theme of Marx that direct political action was unnecessary. The machine was the revolutionary solvent of bourgeois society. Allow the dynamic logic of the machine full play in any kind of society, and it will, Marx said, become communistic automatically. Certainly, America is far more advanced than any other part of the world. May not some of the American panic about the communist threat be a dim recognition of this paradox? So, of course, Marshall's saying these things which come off as concepts, but really he ends it with a question. He's not saying, I know what's right. He's just saying, may not some of this American panic about the communist threat be a dim recognition of this paradox? So Clinton, any comment on that McLuhan on Marx quote?
Well, yeah.
Yeah, you're both cracking up. This is good. We're going back to having fun.
Putting it as a question is a rhetorical ploy on his part. And
yeah,
by 1952, he was not yet the McLuhan we all know as the electrical awareness, telegraph, media awareness guy. But the Mechanical Bride, he's still thinking in terms of production. If you want to, the fourth chapter in Take Today is came out in 1972. That's when he's talking about Marx in terms of his media theory. Where he says stuff like the new service environment created by the increased speed and power of steam, the railway, right, as new extensions of man, was hidden from Marx and all economists then and since. Like Marx, they saw the content of the production and of the form of hardware products pouring out at ever greater speed, more and more stuff being manufactured, more and more stuff being produced, right? We're producing lots and lots of stuff. The message of steam as a new medium was not the products, but the acceleration of all the functions in the social surround, i.e. the new rim spin. So the fact that products could be sent out further and further and further, and then with the telegraph, people could talk more. The fact that we're all splayed and spread out across everywhere, and I'm trying to hold a conversation with two people who are right now living lives in cities completely different from mine, and you're completely different from one another, right? And we're trying to hold together a collective conversation from completely different lives, right? We've got a lot in common because we grew up our parents grew up watching the same 6 TV shows and speaking the same language. That's the thing that we have in common with one another, right? But things are wildly the fact that the cause and effect of what we have to deal with isn't just us in our city anymore or our tribe anymore or our country anymore, but half the stuff in my house was thrown on a boat and shipped from the other side of the world, right? Completely oblivious to me, right? That's more so than the products and their value and their distribution as physical items. Something that economists can barely handle models of, and they make it all abstract and mathematical, and that's why they're alienated from it. I mean, that's the commentary that McLuhan would have on Marx that I would find interesting, not what would be in The Mechanical Bride.
That was really good, because Take Today is an important book. So, Abbie, any comment on that? Or
Well, there's a lot said, and I don't agree with much of it, but
cool.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was totally misquoting and misunderstanding everything Mark said. So,
right.
Just younger.
So,
oh well. We can take it out of the context of all of chapter 4, mind you.
Right. But I'm glad that Clinton did direct us towards Take Today, because that is an important book, and it's 72 as opposed to the quote I use, which is 55.
You said that there were trains in Marx's time. You said there weren't. There wasn't steam, there wasn't trains. There were very much.
Oh, sure. Yes, there were trains. Absolutely. And
I misheard you then. I thought you said there weren't.
Yeah. No, he's saying that there were trains, but they hadn't totally changed the face of economics yet. It was more like, wow, hey, I can buy a ticket and go to Prague in like 4 days, as opposed to, traveling by carriage for 2 months or something like this, right? Like that was the big innovation in trains, I'm sure, in Marx's time, right?
There's definitely changes, but it's kind of the constant refrain. It was happening in the 18th century, 19th century, the 20th century, that, oh, now everything's completely different because of this new technology. And, it's like, there are things which are different, but in terms of how the economy functions, let's say, what's the motive force? It's different from the past when, let's say, in Europe in the Middle Ages, when there was kind of this feudal system, is the basic argument of Marx, where people paid by a certain amount every year by obligation in different forms, versus a system where there's wage earners. That's been consistent to our time from the 17th century until now. So if people look at that level, then we see, okay, certain things are different, but we're still, it seems, in a capitalist system.
What's his name? Charles Fourier, socialist. He wrote in his general book on social sciences about, he wrote this like the year 1790, around there. It was a passage that gets quoted in several places, and it goes along the lines of all of the poets and all the best artists have abandoned their duty to create art and are being bought off by these houses of commerce to write reports on the stock market. And they use their poetic faculties to say things like soaps are flying out of the dishes, or hogs are going up, or and they're writing commodity reports using poetic language to adjust price, right, to screw around with stock market prices, right? And so all the artists are being bought off, and this is an example of what snowballed over 150 years into what McLuhan was then saying. Advertisers are creating all of the value of things people buy, and the commercials are most paid attention to by people who already own the products being advertised. So the people who love to see a car in a magazine are people who already own that car, and they get extra value out of the car, and it's totally worth the money they paid for now, because they see how great it is on the page, right? Media is kind of enchanting the world magically with value in order to adjust the prices and the rents that can be extracted, the surplus, right? All this stuff. And so when the value of the work being done is now part of a mass hallucinatory dream put together by the new media environment, it seems like a far larger bubble to be pricked. Right, and that would be how I would approach the discussion, and how McLuhan is trying to approach the discussion in that chapter that I cited.
Yeah, I have a good example of that. This famous author in America says, her mother lived on an island. She never read books. She said, but she learned how to deal with tsunamis by the songs that her culture taught her. So in the 60s, the cliche line is, kids weren't really reading books like McLuhan. They were listening to rock and roll, and that's how they learned to become activists, and you talk about Bob Dylan, he'll say, "Don't blame me," for Masters of Life. But he did make an impact, and the lyrics, and just listen to the lyrics someday of "I Am the Slime" from your video by Frank Zappa, and think about what we're going through today. It is amazing. But let's end on this question. And of course, I want the dialogue to continue forever. I appreciate your time and energy, gentlemen. This is Tamika Mallory. She's the activist in America who climbed up the flagpole and tore down the Confederate flag. And she's very articulate. I love to hear her speak. Check her out sometime. She had a lot of courage to do that. She says, and this is the question I'm asking both of you, what do you need? And she said, to Biden, we demand justice. We don't need allies. We need accomplices. So, Abbie, any comment on Tamika's quote, and what do you need?
Well, I don't think you're going to get much from Biden. There's been a real problem in America that the liberal left establishment generally goes to sleep when there's a Democrat in office. And it doesn't matter that the same wars go on or actually expanded, and the overall crimes by the corporate elite, or it just expanded the environmental devastation. But no, it's not. At least it's not Trump.
Yeah,
constant rightward shift, and it's like it's terrible. So yeah, and it affects most of the people who are writing, and it's something that Cy Hirsch. I'm a big fan of Cy Hirsch's work, who's been a journalist in America since the '60s.
Yeah,
was an amazing journalist, but his work critiquing the war in Iraq was kind of silenced when Obama got elected, because the Times and others said, "Oh, not now,"
Yeah.
And so it goes right now with Biden. The war at Yemen that keeps them going on, across the board, and increasing drone strikes, and this whistleblower Daniel Hale, who talked about U.S. drone policy and the deaths of civilians, was just sentenced to 45 months in jail. Obama started the attacks on whistleblowers in a new way here, and it just so many people though say, "Oh, but we want Biden to feel our pain, to come along, to do the right thing." And
Yeah.
What are you crazy?
But I mean, that was good, Abbie. But to drop the first two words of Tamika to Biden, just her line: "We demand justice. We don't need allies. We need accomplices." What does that mean to you?
We don't need allies. We need, well, I think there's a grain of positivity where there's this thing in American activism, probably Canada too, where there's thing like, "Oh, these are our allies." It's like a very formal category of, don't get too close to the struggle, but this is your role, is to give me a thumb up on Facebook or something. It's like,
Right.
You want people to be there in the struggle however possible, and this kind of, we have an increasingly caricatured version of humanity, like, "Oh, this person belongs here." And so I think she's probably breaking with that and saying, but it just seems weird if she's saying that Biden is an accomplice, and that's what really rubs me the wrong way.
She's not saying yeah. Anyways.
Oh, can you read it one more time?
Yeah, it's to Biden, we demand justice. We don't need allies. We need accomplices.
It seems like she's saying, "Biden, we need you as an accomplice."
Yeah, you're right. I think that's,
but of course, then I seem like an angry person, because a lot of the country does have faith in whoever our president is to do the right thing.
But that's the follow-up question: is what do you, Abbie, need? She's saying, "I need this." She's an activist. She gets, press on Amy Goodman's show. She's a spokesperson. You're doing what you can do, and we appreciate it. But if just in a personal level, what do you need, Abbie?
I'm trying to make this fast because I've been talking too much, but I recently was actually at a press conference for Daniel Hale, the guy I just mentioned, who was in jail. And I met a very inspiring woman, Susan Schnell, who, if you ever seen a great documentary, Sir No Sir, about resistance among the armed forces in Vietnam, she's interviewed she actually was in the Air Force and had this idea to drop leaflets on U.S. armed bases about the need to resist the war and disobey their orders.
Yeah.
And such. She's still active and organizing. She said the difference between now and the 60s was when she was an activist, then she had to get in people's faces. You know, people really got to hear it out. Like, how do we make this, bring stuff together, do what's necessary, and talk it through? And people really were having those deep conversations. And she said that's not happening right now. People are very, what's the word, automatized.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, and
Mhm.
social media has just made that far worse.
Mhm.
And to me, there is no alternative there. People do have to have those conversations. I think people need to have conversations with people who are serious and to follow through. And without that, we're in bad shape in this country. I think we're in very bad shape in this country right now.
Yeah.
There's no more basis for people to get angry and resist, but the as it said in Marxist terms, the subjective forces are at a pretty low ebb right now. So
Yeah.
that's my take.
That was good. And so the question for you, same thing, Clinton, what do you need personally? You know, in regards to what we've been talking about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like Abbie was just saying. I think where I would go, where I think he was pointing, would be people are scripted in all their conversations now because they're like actors on the global theater. All the conversations have been had, and now we're rehashing those words to get through the conversation. Oh yes, right. That's what allyship is in this derogatory sense, right? This allyship compared to accomplices. It's sort of like how protests have become like a tradition. It's like, oh, we used to, put up a Christmas tree every year, and now we all go to Parliament and we hold signs on this day, right? It's a ritual. It becomes a cargo cult, as you were saying before. Release valve as opposed to an escape route to somewhere truer or better or further along, right? So recognizing how people are out of touch with their material reality altogether, I need what I would need would be a real tangible material story of the material world up until now to be taught more. In the material world, the constitutive media has been computers for the last 60, 70 years, behind the scenes of television, right? We need to look at what the material world is made of before you want to even begin having a conversation about who owns it or what to do with it. And if, as long as we keep acting like apps on a phone and digital commodities are real things that have value, as long as we give value to stuff that the media tells us exist as reified objects, as long as we keep pretending the content of media are real, or that the conversations we're having, which are all things remembered from an episode of John Oliver, last night, as long as people are repeating talking points they got from the TV, they're not even having the conversations of the sort that Abbie's saying need to be had the way that they would have been having decades ago. So recognizing the ground of all that means studying computers. That's what I need. Learn how your computers work, people. I know it's hard. I know it's long. Well, that's where I think. That's where I need you to start.
Well, I think we should rename our series, Clinton. Let's get in your face. That was a great line from Susan. What's her last name, Abbie? You're on mute.
It's Schnell, Schnell, or maybe two L's.
Yeah, no, that's a great. Sir No Sir is a great movie. That's really good. And I think we could also rename it Release Valve or Escape Route. So just in closing, I am going to script my cute little scripty out of context quotes, but this is a great little book I found recently, The World Viewed. It's the reflections on film studies. And here they are quoting on page 92. When to Hegel's comment that historical events occur twice, Karl Marx added the tag, the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. He was expressing both the genius that set him apart from his age and the genius that placed him inside it. So it's been great to be inside both your brains. And your generous time to express yourself tonight, gentlemen.
Can I?
Carl, go ahead. Go ahead.
Because it relates to your life, and I'm sorry to prolong the ending.
Sorry, don't be sorry. Well, that's what we're here for. Go ahead.
What's needed? This came to mind and on the subject, and also I wanted to say I was a little bit testy about McLuhan in the beginning, and I think McLuhan has a lot of insight into things, and right now we're very much grappling with people being preyed upon by our digital monsters, and I think McLuhan has a lot to say about that. So this poem is on that subject. It's by a political prisoner in India, G.N. Sai Baba, and it goes, "My fellow prisoners, don't be agonized. You'll get free soon. From the treacherous Facebook, the high walls of the World Wide Web, and the shackles of the conjuring screens, you'll soon walk out free into the beautiful mornings, warmly hugging your loved ones. The virtual reigns the world of lives through the monstrous regimes and their corporate demons. The lures of their net, the baits of their hooks made you prisoners, trapped in the data. My fellow prisoners, don't be agonized. You'll get free soon. The Facebook will be erased forever. The Twitter will turn off. The computing clouds will crash. The WhatsApp will vanish, and the Google will be gone. You'll rise from your chairs, cushions, beds, and be off the screens of oppression. You'll see the world outside the gates of the prison. You'll taste the food without a twinge of the net and enjoy your freedom without fidgeting. You'll love the people again. You'll be human again. You'll overcome the data banks, cease to be the vote banks, and free off the digital gallows. My fellow prisoners, don't be agonized. You'll be free soon. You have nothing to lose but the chains of the data. You've a world to win. Netizens of the world, unite. 24th of March, 2018, from the high security prison cell Nagpur to the fellow citizens, prisoners of the global virtual space. Written to Sanjay.
Beautiful. What a poem, man. We love poetry. And you even used Clinton's word netizen, or, he's a word that he uses. That was well done, Abbie. Definitely. Yeah. Netizens. Definitely send me that poem or a link to it. That was beautiful. And it was great reading poetry. Poetry can communicate before it's understood. And that was very clearly understood by me. And I'm a lambo when it comes to understanding poetry. So thank you so much. I just wanted to end with this one line that I read from Karl Marx. Of course, it's out of context, but it sort of summarizes this time I spent with both of you. Surround yourself with people who make you happy, people who make you laugh, who help you when you are in need, people who genuinely care. So thanks for caring, Abbie. Thanks for caring, Clinton.
Thank you, Gerry, for pulling this all together.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're an inspiration.
Thank you.
You're a beacon of hope.